There's a moment after a crisis that tells you more about the crisis itself. It's not the moment when everyone is panicking, nor the time when speeches are the loudest, and it's not even the moment when the danger finally passes, but it's the moment after all of that, when the streets have gone quiet and when the newspapers and journalists have moved on, the dead have been buried, and then adrenaline perhaps drains out of the room. And the question becomes, what do we do now? So, in the summer of 1866, cholera tears through the East End of London. And it's one of those phrases, cholera in London, that perhaps sounds really tidy, but it isn't tidy. It's particular and local and water and neighbourhoods. And down by the docks in Wapping, the Radcliffe Highway territory, a priest named Charles Lowder stays. And we've done that video. He's not a mythic figure in the moment. He's just there. He just remains. And in the parish that becomes St. Peter's London Docks, he stays and he stays. And having told that story on this channel, this isn't a video about that cholera outbreak. It's about what came afterwards, because in 1867, here's my copy of it, Lowder publishes something that doesn't look heroic at all. It's a long letter, perhaps a bit like a case file, and it's addressed to the Bishop of London. Sadly, I only have a facsimile of it. You know how I love my original documents, but this is about St. Katherine's Hospital. It's about revenues and money and endowments and what they're actually for. And yes, I know we're doing endowments, but I'm telling you, this is where theology still remains sharp. One of the easiest mistakes to make with Victorian epidemics is to tell a story of progress. You just go, cholera comes, science advances, sewers are built, everyone learns, problem solved. And yes, some of that is true. The great stink of 1858 forces Parliament's hand, really, and Joseph Bazalgette drives a huge sewer project through, and that stuff is important. But then you get to 1866 anyway, and what's so grim about 1866 is that it isn't just this mysterious visitation, it's a failure you can point at. Because after 1866, William Farr, who's basically the Victorian statsman, the numbers man, finally accepts the waterborne case properly and fully, and he shows mortality is extremely high among people supplied from the old Ford Reservoir in East London. So cholera isn't only revealing germs, it is also revealing to us infrastructure, and it's revealing supply, and it's revealing which neighbourhoods are being protected and which are being left to absorb the risk with their own bodies. And I want to put this carefully, because some suffering is not fate, it's almost accidental. It's about being placed in a certain position, but it's also the placement of water and the placement of housing, the placement of money, and in the end, a placement of who gets listened to by the people in power. And that's not the whole story, but it is enough of the story for it to matter. Now, we need to talk about something that sounds boring until you realize it's the whole point. That is St. Katherine's Hospital. And just to be clear, this is not a hospital in the modern NHS sense. It's a medieval royal foundation which involves worship, community, and care. And it's founded in the mid-12th century, sort of 1847-48. It's associated with Queen Matilda, and it's beside the Tower of London. And very early, and the structure is explicit, it's a small religious community, a 13 poor person unit, and are held within it. It's a duty of the local community and the church. And so St. Katherine stays by the tower for centuries, right on the edge of where the city and the economy of the river meet. And then in the 1820s, London did what London continues to do. The docks expand, so the site is cleared to create St. Katherine Docks. And here's the tiny facts that stop this being an abstract. To build the docks between 1826 and 1828, the hospital and the church are pulled down, along with 1,200 houses, and over 11,000 people are displaced. 11,000. And the project isn't a back alley local job, it's elite engineering. Enter our principal engineer, Thomas Telford, and Philip Hardwick designs warehouses and iron columns rising right at the quayside. So Capital gets a beautiful new machine. And if you don't mind, I just want to pause on that for a second. Thomas Telford, because if you live in Shropshire, like I do, this isn't an abstract Victorian engineer's name. There's literally a town called Telford, and the new town was renamed Telford in 1968 after Thomas Telford. And it fits because Telford is one of those men where you look up and realize that half the country seems to be standing on his work. He starts as a mason, he's self-made, and then ends up as surveyor of public works in Shropshire in the late 1780s. His projects of roads and bridges, the kind of work that changes how a country breathes and moves. He's doing work around Shrewsbury and in Bridgenorth. He's doing castle, prison, civic stuff. And then he's off building the big headline pieces, things like canals and aqueducts and bridges and churches, and then work which makes his name nationally. So when you hear Thomas Telford design the docks, you should hear this is not a decorative architect job. This is one of the era's top problem solvers. And St. Katharine's Dock is a proper problem. It is a cramped, over 20-acre site, 2 docks linked by a basin with 1 entrance lock, and a deadline that basically says, make it trade ready fast. The engineering paper on it says that up to 1,000 workers were on site, and even with a major flood, the first ship enters the docks in 1828, about 3 years after the contracts were signed. I think that matters because when money wants docks, you get speed and you get force and you get 1,200 houses pulled down and 11,000 people moved and a medieval hospital cleared, like it's just all in the way. So that's the story. The docks get built and the poor get moved. And it's important to say this cleanly, that Lowder is not asking for revolution. He's not calling for confiscation, and he's not doing a manifesto. He's doing something which many of us find perhaps more irritating. He's doing institutional against the institution, because his 1867 letter is basically saying you cannot keep the money where it is. And you cannot then pretend the purpose stayed the same when the people are no longer there. And he's not guessing. He's writing like a historian. He writes, in effect, this hospital was founded for worship and mercy for the poor by the tower. And if the poor have been displaced east and the need is concentrated east, then the endowment needs to follow the reason it exists. And I know why this makes perhaps diocesan officers itch, because it turns charity into a question about location. It's not sentiment anymore, it's location. And it forces the uncomfortable question, Is the church prepared to fund staying or only praise those who stayed? Now, a quick note about the man on the other end of this letter, because as we know from the Bible and everything, that letters are from one person and sent to another. This isn't a friendly Christmas card. This is a nice, long letter. But it is received and sent to the Bishop of London, and he can often sound like a faceless Victorian silhouette, but this one had a name. His name was Archibald Campbell Tate. He was not a cosy Roman Catholic patron. In no way was he a ritualist sympathizer. He's usually described as Broadchurch, a managerial moderating figure who's more concerned with holding the church together than wearing a party rosette. He becomes Bishop of London in 1856, and that's the same year Lowder arrives in London docks. And it's right as London is changing faster than the church seems to be able to keep up. And he stays in that post until 1868, when he goes on to get the big job and become the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he's also, let's bluntly say, he is wary of ritual. He's part of that Victorian nervousness that sees candles and vestments and immediately hears Rome. So when Lowder writes to this bishop about moving old money towards East End mission, it isn't him preaching to the choir. He is pushing a door that at best doesn't open naturally, and at worst is a door that has been locked for years. And here's the bit I love, because it's so human and so Church of England. Even though Tate is suspicious of ritual, and even though the ritual controversies get ugly, Tate is capable of saying there are limits and no, we will not attack it like that. Because later in biographies of him, you see that there's a striking detail. There's an attempt to prosecute Charles Lowder of St. Peter's London docks in 1878. And the biographers say that Tate himself vetoed it. And I just wonder if it's maybe relating back to his time when he was Bishop of London. He was also the patron of St. Peter's, and then he refused to let this prosecution proceed. So he isn't on Lowder's side as a ritualist, but he can see when enforcement becomes this persecution or when law becomes a weapon. And I think that helps us, because it means that Lowder's letter of 1867 is not addressed to a romantic ally. It's addressed to a cautious, powerful, balancing bishop who has to decide what counts as the church's business and what gets left in the East End as perhaps someone else's problem. Okay, let's get back to cholera, because here's the connection. Lowder isn't writing this in a vacuum. He has lived in the London Docklands mission for a decade by now. He joins the mission at St. George's in the East in August 1856. He lives in the mission house on Calvert Street, Radcliffe Highway, and he builds schools and relief and all of it. And he doesn't do this in theory. Then in 1860, he secures the site where St. Peter's London Docks is going to be built, and the church is consecrated on the 30th of June, 1866. So the cholera isn't sometime later an interesting incident. It lands right on the hinge of the project finishing, right as the church becomes real. And the point is this, that cholera teaches you what breaks first. It's not your theology that breaks, because actually I don't think that does break for Lowder. It is your systems. It is staff and water and money and rooms and laundry and food and perhaps coal as you're heading into autumn, winter, and time. And after you've seen that, a letter about endowments can stop being boring, because it becomes the question, will anything move? Now cholera has been and gone. Lowder's proposal in the letter is not vague. He wants a properly resourced presence in the East. It's not one exhausted priest trying to hold the line. It's a community. There's clergy living by rule, and sisters and teachers and lay helpers, and it's a structure that can outlast illnesses and riots and poverty and even burnout and maybe time. Because that's the reality of Victorian Dockland's work. It's not a heroic campaign, it's just being weathered by what's happening. And this is where the Lowder story gets very unromantic, because he's not asking for inspiration, he's asking for money. He wants a budget that makes presence possible. He's trying to make staying sustainable, which is a very different thing. When we look at staying and remaining, we often see it as admirable. And I should be careful here, because Lowder does not always talk in the way that I want him to. He is still a Victorian. He still reaches for Providence language. And sometimes I read a line and think, yeah, you're right, but don't say it like that. But I can't time travel. So he wrote what he wrote. But here's what I cannot ignore. He doesn't turn cholera into a neat sermon illustration, drop the mic and walk away. He goes for the nerve, to the root of the problem. He asks what the church is actually doing with old wealth in a city that has physically moved poverty eastward. And honestly, that makes it feel modern. Not the way he dressed or the incense arguments or the riots, but the money. Because money is where institutions say what they really believe. And Lowder is stubborn enough to force that conversation into the open. One of the quiet themes in this whole after cholera moment is a theme of this channel which comes up a lot, which is memory. I think that Lowder writes so that forgetting doesn't get to tidy up the story. Because I think forgetting nuance and details and looking at secondhand information turns suffering into this sort of inevitability. And inevitability is incredibly convenient. It lets everyone say, well, what can you do? Perhaps today's phrase in that is, it is what it is. I really hate that phrase, to be honest. But 1866 had specific fingerprints, because Fowler's work points at a specific supply, that public health debate points to accountability. There's a whole argument afterwards about companies and oversight. So memory here isn't just doing nostalgia and remembrance. It's showing us the pressure that was really there. It's a refusal to let the city moralize without paying the price. I think this letter can be awkward for modern Christians, because it asks a question that we so often hate. Where is our money living? Not where do our feelings live, or where do the things we say, where does our theology live, but where does our capital actually live? And the real question is, does it line up with where, perhaps this is what Lowder would say, does it line up with where people are dying and where people cannot leave? And it's uncomfortably historically too, by the way, because St. Katharine's does not survive the demolition and is relocated in the 1820s near Regent's Park. And it stays there for more than a century before returning to the East End after the Second World War. So the institution doesn't stop, it continues. And the question is, what does it mean for a charity founded for the poor by the Tower to end up somewhere greener and quieter, and perhaps more yellow and red on Booth's maps at the end of the 19th century? And this is not a cheap gotcha. I hate cheap gotchas, but it is the point, because Lowder is saying purpose is not a label in a museum, and that purpose has to travel, and we have to be more intentional about how we care for the vulnerable and the poor. So let's be clear. The Cholera Appendix and the St. Katharine's Letter are not two distinct separate works. They are perhaps two halves of the same theology. One shows you what happens when systems, big institutional systems, fail. And then the other asks why the system was structured that way in the first place, and whether the church will keep subsidizing the failure with these heroic clergy who we love, or I love at least, hearing about, or are they going to start moving serious resources to the problem? Cholera taught Lowder how fragile life is. And this letter, the St. Katharine's Letter, presses the church on how avoidable some of that fragility actually was. Not all of it, but enough to make a difference. Enough to make the phrase of "we did our best" sound a little bit too easy. Lowder never claims victory. He never claims to understand suffering. What he claims is way simpler than that the church must stay when explanations run out. But that staying also requires people and rooms and coal and systems and memory and, yes, money. So the St. Katharine's Letter isn't a distraction from his ministry. It's not something he sat up late at night going, I must do this in my spare time. It's actually embedded in his ministry, and it's an institutional expression of what he believed and who he was. It's him asking whether the church will fund the present before the next crisis arrives, and not whether it'll fund it for a week, and not in this big blaze of glory, but in the quiet middle, that whether or not the church will change where the resources go before the moment of crisis arrived. I think the church is still asking that question, and I wonder if institutions that lurch from one crisis to the next, whether they be religious or political or health or anything, these big institutions are very bad at preempting the problem, and they only get money and investment thrown at them as they are on the verge of collapse. And I think that is what Lowder is trying to prevent. He's trying to bring systems in that can be in place before the next crisis arrived. We'll end it there. I'm Matthew. This is Empire of the Sunlight. If you want more of this, the weird moral afterlife of religious history of England, whether it be ritualism, heavy metal, evangelicalism, or anything else, even Mormonism, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and join me as we go on this crazy journey of religious history of England. God bless.